Hey guys, have you ever thought about the eerie similarities between the case of Darlie Routier and the case of Christopher Watts? There are quite a few. Both couples were broke, yet both couples seemed to really care about appearing as if they weren't. In the case of Christopher Watts, we learned that I think there were 3 months straight where Christopher Watts' wife failed to make the house payment, and he had to take, I think it was 10,000 out of his retirement account in order to save the house. In the case of Christopher Watts, we learned there was a bankruptcy. We were told at one point that it was because of all of Christopher Watts' wife's health challenges. But then we took a look at some of those documents and thought, I don't think so, considering the minuscule amount that was actually discharged that had anything at all to do with any medical services compared to the department store credit cards, which seemed to be the bulk of the bankruptcy debt. In the case of Darlie Routier, they were evidently behind on their house payment, and her charge cards were maxed out, which is another similarity with the case of Christopher Watts, because we learned that at some point in the middle of the night, after arriving home from a weekend meeting as a promoter with a multi-level marketing company, that the charge card was denied when there was a purchase for hair care products that didn't go through. In Darlie's case, her husband was behind on the rent on his shop, and I think his car was broken down at the time, so they were down to just one car between them. Although, back in the day when poor little Devin and Damon Routier were murdered in what should have been the safety of their own home, daycare centers weren't all over the place like they are now. They were still pretty new. So Darlie's kids weren't at a daycare center like poor little Bella and Cece were. Darlie's kids were actually at home, and Darlie was actually a stay-at-home mom. Did you know that Darlie was overheard yelling at the children to get the hell out of her house? Did you know that the day before poor little Damon died, that he spent most of the afternoon riding his bicycle around the neighborhood all by himself? Well, Devin stayed most of the afternoon at a friend's house, and then at dinner time, he called and asked if it would be okay if he stayed overnight at his friend's house too. Darlie liked to travel, whether or not they could afford it. She had a trip planned for Mexico with one of her girlfriends, leaving or planning to leave her husband and children at home. And she also had a trip planned for the following week. On that vacation, she was planning on taking her husband and her children with her. She wanted to spend a couple of weeks out east at her hometown, visiting with family and friends. In my opinion, in both cases, both women showed signs of needing some help. But it looks like both women chose instead to keep spending money, to keep pretending that they weren't broke, and to keep right on telling their husbands exactly what to do, when to do it, and how. And in both cases, it seems like the husbands pretty much did what they were told and did their best to try to keep their wives from yelling at them or from being upset with them or from being disappointed in them. Both husbands in these cases were hands-on parents taking care of the kids, even though their wives didn't work outside of the home at all. They cleaned the house, they fed the babies, they helped prepare the meals. Well, they also worked all day trying to support the family and trying to support their wife's spending habits. There's another similarity that I find interesting, and that is that when Darlie's friend was begging her to get help, she told her that she didn't think that would look good in a custody battle down the road. And she said she did not want her mother-in-law to get custody of her children. Well, remember the nut meltdown, right? When Christopher Watt's wife told her mother-in-law, or I should say yelled at her mother-in-law, that the girls would never step foot in her house again. Interesting.